A mother and daughter step off a plane in paradise. 10 days later, one of them is dead, stuffed inside a suitcase, abandoned in a taxi. The person responsible? Someone she loved more than life itself. This is the story of the Bali suitcase murder, and what you're about to hear will shake you to your core. Welcome to The Untold Cold Case. I'm your host, and today we're traveling to one of the most beautiful places on Earth to uncover one of its darkest stories. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on your notifications so you never miss a case. And if you appreciate the work we do, please take a second to like this video and drop a comment below. It truly helps us continue bringing you these stories. Today's case takes us to Bali, Indonesia. When you hear that name, certain images probably come to mind. Pristine beaches with white sand stretching into turquoise water. Luxury resorts with infinity pools overlooking the ocean. Temples and rice terraces. Warm tropical breezes. Bali has built its reputation as a sanctuary, a place where people go to escape, to heal, to find themselves. Every year, millions of tourists flock to this Indonesian island seeking peace and tranquility. But what happened in August of 2014 would prove that no amount of beauty can protect you from the darkness that sometimes lives within families. That distance and luxury cannot erase conflict. And that sometimes, the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers in foreign lands. It comes from the people sitting across the breakfast table from you. This is the story of Sheila Von Wiese-Mack and her teenage daughter, Heather. It's a story about wealth and privilege, about a mother's unconditional love, and about how that love would ultimately cost her everything. It's about manipulation, greed, and a murder so calculated that it would capture international headlines and spark legal battles spanning 2 continents and nearly a decade. What happened inside room 202 of the Street Regis Bali Resort didn't happen in a vacuum. To understand how a daughter could participate in the murder of her own mother, we need to go back to Chicago, back to a family that, from the outside, seemed to have everything, back to the moment when tragedy first struck and set into motion a chain of events that would end in unimaginable violence. But first, let me take you to the morning of August 12th, 2014, the morning when everything came to light. It was a typical morning in Bali. The sun was already climbing in the sky, warming the island, bringing tourists out to beaches and breakfast buffets. Outside the street, Regis Resort, one of the most exclusive hotels in Bali, a taxi driver sat in his car, waiting. He'd been hired by a young couple, foreign tourists, who had loaded a large suitcase into his trunk. They told him they needed to run back inside the hotel quickly. They'd be right back, they said. Just a few minutes. But minutes turned into an hour. Then, more. The driver was growing frustrated. Every moment he sat there waiting was a moment he wasn't making money. Other fares were passing him by. His patience was wearing thin. Finally, he made a decision. He stepped out of the vehicle and walked to the back of the car. Maybe they'd left something in the suitcase. Maybe there was some clue about where they'd gone or when they'd return. He opened the trunk. The suitcase was large, heavy, expensive looking. The kind of luggage wealthy tourists carry. He reached for it, and that's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Liquid. Dark liquid seeping from the edges of the case. And the smell. There was a smell that shouldn't be there. The driver stumbled backward. His mind was racing, trying to process what he was seeing, what he was smelling. But deep down, he already knew. Something was very wrong. Without touching the suitcase again, he slammed the trunk shut, got behind the wheel, and drove straight to the nearest police station. Officers approached the taxi cautiously. The driver was clearly shaken, gesturing frantically at his trunk, speaking rapidly. They opened it. They saw the blood. And then, with the careful precision of trained professionals, they removed the suitcase and opened it. Inside was the body of a woman. She appeared to be in her 50s or early 60s. Blonde hair, now matted and dark with blood. Her face was badly damaged. Her body was contorted, forced into the confined space. She was fully clothed, but her clothes were stained. It was immediately clear that she had suffered tremendously before death. The medical examiner would later determine the full extent of her injuries. Multiple blunt force trauma wounds to her head, defensive wounds covering her arms and hands, indicating she had fought her attacker. Several of her fingers were broken. The bones in her face had been fractured. But what ultimately killed her wasn't the blows themselves. The trauma to her face had caused severe swelling that blocked her airway. She had suffocated, likely while still conscious, unable to breathe through her damaged nose and throat. It was a brutal, terrifying way to die. And it had happened just hours earlier, in a luxury resort room, while other guests slept peacefully just feet away. Police immediately began working to identify the victim. They examined the suitcase itself. Expensive. Designer. There were luggage tags still attached. The tags led them to the street, Regis Bali Resort, where they learned the suitcase belonged to a guest named Sheila Von Wiese-Mack, an American woman from the Chicago area. She had been staying at the resort with her teenage daughter, Heather Mack. Officers rushed to the hotel. They spoke with the front desk staff, with security, with housekeeping. The story that emerged was troubling. Sheila and Heather had checked in on August 9th, just 3 days earlier. They were supposed to be staying for over a week, but the daughter, Heather, had checked out abruptly that morning, claiming they were leaving early. She had not mentioned her mother. She had not reported anything wrong. She had simply gathered their belongings and left, or tried to leave. Hotel employees had more to share. They told police that the mother and daughter had been arguing, a lot. Loud arguments in the hallways, raised voices in the restaurant. Other guests had complained about the noise coming from their room late at night. Whatever vacation this was supposed to be, it clearly wasn't going well. But there was another detail that immediately caught investigators' attention. When Heather checked out, she didn't have her passport. Sheila had been holding both passports for safekeeping. That meant Heather couldn't have left the country. She was still in Bali, and police needed to find her immediately. Within hours, working with hotel records and immigration data, police located Heather Mack and her boyfriend, Tommy Schaefer, at a budget hotel near the airport. They were arrested without incident. Both were taken into custody. Both immediately insisted they had done nothing wrong. Both claimed they had no idea what had happened to Sheila. But the evidence told a very different story, and as investigators began digging into the backgrounds of these two young people, a picture emerged of a relationship built on resentment, manipulation, and greed. A picture of two people who saw one woman as the only obstacle standing between them and the life they wanted. To understand what happened in that hotel room in Bali, we need to go back to Chicago, back to Oak Park, an affluent suburb just west of the city, back to a time when Sheila Von Wiese-Mack was alive, when her family was intact, when the future seemed bright. Sheila Von Wiese-Mack was, by all accounts, a woman who loved life and loved people. She came from a prominent family and moved in elite social circles. Those who knew her described her as warm, generous, and vivacious. She loved hosting gatherings at her Oak Park home. She loved bringing people together. She had a passion for fine wine, classic literature, and good conversation. Her home was always open, her table always set for guests. Friends said that when you were with Sheila, you felt welcomed, valued, like you were part of something special. Sheila had married James Mack, a celebrated jazz and classical composer. James was highly respected in the music world, having worked on over 60 jazz albums throughout his career. He was constantly in demand, collaborating with renowned musicians, composing original pieces, arranging classics. The couple lived a life that many would envy. Cultural events, art gallery openings, symphony performances, travel to Europe and beyond. Their Oak Park home was filled with art, music, and love. And then, Heather was born. For Sheila and James, their daughter's arrival completed their family. She was their only child, and they doted on her absolutely. Sheila's sister, Debbie, would later recall that every wall in their home was covered with photographs of Heather, birthday parties, ballet recitals, family vacations, Heather was the center of their universe, the light of their lives. By all accounts, Heather had a happy childhood. She attended good schools. She took dance lessons and music lessons. She was encouraged to explore her creativity and her interests. James, in particular, shared a special bond with his daughter. They were both drawn to the arts. Heather loved music and theater and ballet, and James nurtured those passions. Heather would later describe herself as a daddy's girl, and everyone who knew the family could see how close they were. But in 2006, when Heather was around 10 years old, everything changed. James and Sheila took a cruise, one of the many trips they enjoyed together. But during the voyage, James fell suddenly and seriously ill. He had developed a severe infection that had spread to his spinal cord. The medical intervention was aggressive, but the damage was done. When James recovered from the acute infection, he could no longer walk. He would need a wheelchair for the rest of his life. This was a devastating blow for the family. James had been active, vibrant, constantly moving through the world creating music. Now he faced a new reality of limited mobility and dependence on others. But James adapted. He continued his work as much as he could. He continued being a father to Heather and a husband to Sheila. The family tried to maintain their routines, their joy, their connection. Then, a few years after the infection, James received more bad news. He was diagnosed with colon cancer. Now, in his mid-70s, James faced yet another health battle. The treatments were difficult. The prognosis was uncertain. But he fought. And Sheila and Heather fought alongside him. In 2010, hoping to give James a break from medical appointments and treatments, the family decided to take a trip to Greece. It was meant to be a respite, a chance to breathe, to be together in a beautiful place and remember that life still held moments of peace and beauty. They traveled to Greece and checked into their hotel. For a few days, things seemed okay. They explored. They ate good food. They tried to relax. But then, one afternoon, while Sheila was out, tragedy struck in the most sudden and unexpected way. James was in the hotel room with Heather, who was now around 14 years old. Suddenly, without warning, James stopped breathing. A blood clot had formed and traveled to his lung. Pulmonary embolism. It was catastrophic and immediate. By the time medical help arrived, there was nothing that could be done. James Mack, celebrated composer, devoted husband, loving father, was gone, dead at 76, in a hotel room in Greece, with his teenage daughter by his side. The loss was shattering for both Sheila and Heather. James had been the heart of their family. For Sheila, he had been her partner for decades. For Heather, he had been her champion, her confidant, the parent she felt closest to, and now he was gone. Suddenly, without warning, without a chance to say goodbye. Grief affects people in different ways. Some people withdraw. Some people seek support. Some people throw themselves into activity to avoid feeling the pain. Heather's grief manifested as rage. Specifically, rage at her mother. In Heather's mind, the trip to Greece had been Sheila's idea. Her father hadn't wanted to go, she told herself. If they had stayed home, he would still be alive. It didn't matter that this wasn't logical. It didn't matter that a blood clot could have happened anywhere, at any time. Heather needed someone to blame. And she chose her mother. From that point forward, the relationship between Sheila and Heather began to deteriorate rapidly. Heather became defiant, angry, oppositional. Every interaction between them seemed to end in conflict. Sheila tried everything she could think of. Different parenting approaches, therapy, consequences, rewards. Nothing seemed to reach her daughter. Heather was pulling further and further away, and Sheila was powerless to stop it. As Heather entered her mid-teens, the behavioral issues escalated dramatically. She started skipping school regularly. Then she stopped going altogether and eventually dropped out completely. She began stealing Sheila's car and taking it for joyrides. She stole money from Sheila's purse. She stayed out all night without permission or communication. She started associating with older teenagers and young adults, many of whom Sheila felt were a bad influence. The police became regular visitors to the Mack household. Officers were called for underage drinking, for domestic disturbances, for theft. Records would later show that police responded to the Oak Park home 86 times over a period of several years. 86 separate incidents. That's more than once a month. Month after month. Year after year. Family members and family friends witnessed Heather's behavior and were deeply concerned. They described explosive outbursts, physical violence. On multiple occasions, Heather physically attacked her mother. She would bite, scratch, hit, and shove. During one altercation, Heather shoved Sheila so hard that Sheila fell and broke her arm. The injury required medical treatment. It took weeks to heal. Every single time, police responded and asked Sheila if she wanted to press charges against her daughter. Sheila refused. She had already lost her husband. The thought of having her daughter arrested, of having a record that could follow Heather for life, was unbearable. Sheila believed that with enough love, enough patience, enough support, she could help Heather heal from the trauma of losing her father. She believed things would eventually get better. But things didn't get better. They got worse. Heather became pregnant during her teenage years, then pregnant again. She was engaging in increasingly risky behavior. Her anger toward her mother seemed to intensify rather than diminish with time. Sheila reached out to psychiatric professionals, desperate for help. She brought Heather to evaluations at mental health facilities. In one email to a close friend, Sheila poured out her fear and exhaustion. She described Heather as disturbed and very sick. She mentioned that intake professionals at a psychiatric facility had recommended immediate inpatient hospitalization, but that Heather had refused to comply, and Sheila couldn't force her. The email ended with words that would later seem tragically prophetic. Sheila wrote, "I am really scared of what she may do next. Despite everything, despite the violence and the theft and the constant chaos, Sheila never stopped trying. She never stopped loving her daughter. She continued to provide for Heather financially. She bought her clothes, gave her money, made sure she had what she needed. She tried to create opportunities for them to connect. She planned trips. She invited Heather to cultural events. She kept reaching out, kept hoping that something would break through. But there was another factor at play, one that would ultimately prove deadly: money. Specifically, James Mack's estate. Before his death, James had updated his will. He left behind substantial wealth, $11 million in assets, an additional $1.5 million in a trust fund, specifically for Heather. It was a fortune by any standard, enough money to live extremely comfortably for life. However, there was a stipulation in the will. Heather would inherit the full estate only after Sheila's death. As long as Sheila was alive, she controlled the assets. She could provide for Heather, help her financially, but Heather didn't have independent access to the full inheritance. This arrangement is not uncommon. It's designed to protect young beneficiaries from making impulsive decisions with large sums of money before they're mature enough to handle it wisely. But for Heather, this arrangement felt like an obstacle. And when she met Tommy Schaefer, that obstacle would begin to seem like something that could be removed. Heather met Tommy at a party when she was 18 years old. He was 21, an aspiring rapper who performed under various stage names. From the moment they met, there was an intense connection. They quickly became inseparable. Heather was drawn to Tommy's confidence, his edge, his willingness to validate all of her anger toward her mother. Tommy was drawn to Heather's wealth and the promise of more to come. Sheila immediately disliked Tommy. She felt he was a negative influence on Heather, who was already struggling. She didn't like his attitude. She didn't like the way he spoke. She certainly didn't like the way he spoke about her. And the feeling was entirely mutual. Tommy openly hated Sheila. He made no effort to hide his contempt for her. As Heather and Tommy's relationship deepened, their conversations took on an increasingly dark tone. Text messages between them revealed troubling content. They referred to each other as Bonnie and Clyde, romanticizing the image of being partners in crime. They discussed violence, They discussed what they would do with money, specifically with Heather's inheritance. And there was one unavoidable truth hanging over all of these conversations. As long as Sheila was alive, Heather didn't have full access to her father's money. Tommy didn't have access to it. They couldn't live the life they envisioned, free from rules and responsibility, as long as Sheila stood in the way. In their distorted thinking, there was only one solution. Sheila had to die. But despite everything happening beneath the surface, Sheila kept trying. She kept believing that she could repair her relationship with her daughter. She kept looking for opportunities to connect. And in the summer of 2014, she came up with an idea. A trip. Just the two of them. Somewhere beautiful and peaceful. Somewhere they could talk without distractions. Somewhere they could remember that they were family. Sheila chose Bali. It's hard to imagine a more idyllic destination. She booked them into the Regis Resort, one of the finest hotels on the island. 10 nights. Luxury accommodations. A chance to reset. On August 2nd, 2014, Sheila and Heather boarded a flight from Chicago to Bali. They flew business class. Photographs taken during the flight and posted to social media show them smiling together. Heather has her arm around her mother. They look happy, relaxed, like any mother and daughter excited about a vacation together. More photos were posted once they arrived in Bali. The two of them at dinner, at the pool, on an excursion. In every image, they appear close, affectionate, enjoying each other's company. Anyone scrolling through Heather's social media would have seen a loving relationship between mother and daughter. They would have seen no signs of conflict, no hints of what was really happening, no indication of what was about to occur. But the photos told only part of the story. Hotel staff and other guests witnessed something very different. They reported frequent arguments between Sheila and Heather, raised voices in hallways, tension at meals, shouting coming from their room late at night. Other guests complained about the noise. Staff members noticed the strained dynamic between them. Whatever bonding Sheila had hoped for wasn't happening, and there was something else happening, something Sheila didn't know about. Heather hadn't come to Bali just with her mother. She had made other arrangements. Tommy Schaefer was also in Bali. He had flown there separately and was staying at a budget hotel not far from the Regis. He and Heather had been in contact since their arrival. They had been planning, waiting, looking for the right opportunity to execute the plan they'd discussed back in Chicago. That opportunity came on the night of August 11th, 2014. It was their third night at the resort. By this point, Sheila and Heather had been in Bali for 9 days total, with the last 3 spent at the Regis. Whatever hopes Sheila had held for this trip had clearly not materialized. The arguments had continued. The distance between them remained. We don't know exactly what Sheila was thinking that night as she got ready for bed. Maybe she was planning one more attempt at a heart-to-heart with her daughter. Maybe she was resigned to the fact that this trip hadn't brought them closer. Maybe she was already thinking ahead to their return to Chicago and what would come next. We'll never know. Because that night, while Sheila slept in her hotel room, Heather let Tommy into the room. And what happened next was brutal. I want to be careful here in how I describe what occurred. This channel is committed to telling these stories truthfully but respectfully. What matters is this. Sheila was attacked while she was most vulnerable. The attack was vicious and prolonged. She fought back. The defensive wounds all over her arms and hands tell us that she fought desperately for her life. Several of her fingers were broken as she tried to protect herself. But she was overpowered. The medical examiner would later determine that Sheila suffered multiple blunt force trauma injuries to her head. The injuries to her face were particularly severe. The trauma caused significant swelling that ultimately blocked her airway. Unable to breathe through her damaged nose and throat, she suffocated. It would have been a terrifying way to die. Conscious, struggling for air, helpless. The murder itself would have taken time, but the aftermath required even more time and careful planning. Heather and Tommy now had a body to deal with. They couldn't simply leave the room and hope no one would notice. The room was registered in Sheila's name. Housekeeping would come in the morning. The body would be discovered immediately. So they made a decision that would later shock investigators and the public alike. They forced Sheila's body into one of the suitcases they'd brought with them. It was a large case, but still, fitting a full-grown woman's body inside required significant force and a disturbing level of disregard for her humanity. This was Heather's mother. The woman who had given birth to her, raised her, loved her unconditionally despite years of rejection and violence. And now Heather was stuffing her body into luggage like she was disposing of garbage. Once the body was secured in the suitcase, they called for a taxi. They loaded the suitcase into the trunk. Then they told the driver they needed to run back into the hotel briefly. They would return in just a few minutes, they said. They left the suitcase in the car and disappeared. Their plan, presumably, was to let the taxi driver discover the body far away from the hotel, giving them time to flee the island before the body was even identified. But things didn't go according to plan. The taxi driver, after waiting over an hour, opened the trunk. He saw the blood. He immediately drove to the police station, and within hours, investigators had identified the victim and the suspects. Heather and Tommy were found at a nearby hotel, attempting to figure out their next move. They were arrested before they could leave Bali. During the initial interrogation, both denied involvement. Heather claimed she didn't know what had happened. Tommy insisted he wasn't there, but the evidence was overwhelming. Hotel security cameras showed Tommy entering the street Regis the night of the murder. Forensic evidence placed him in the room. Text messages between Heather and Tommy discussed the trip to Bali and what would happen there. Eventually, under sustained questioning, the story began to emerge. Tommy admitted to being the one who struck Sheila. He claimed Heather wasn't directly involved in the physical attack. Heather, for her part, claimed she had been afraid of Tommy, that he had forced her to participate, that she was a victim too. But investigators weren't buying Heather's version of events. The text messages showed willing participation and planning. The evidence showed she had let Tommy into the room. She had been present during the murder. She had helped dispose of the body. And perhaps most damningly, there was motive. With her mother dead, Heather would inherit millions of dollars. She and Tommy had discussed this repeatedly in their messages. They had referred to themselves as Bonnie and Clyde, partners in crime working together toward a common goal. There was another complication that emerged during the investigation. Heather was pregnant. She was carrying Tommy's child. This fact would later influence her sentencing, but it also added another layer of tragedy to the story. This child would be born in prison, with a mother convicted of murder and a father serving time for the same crime. The child would grow up knowing that her grandmother was killed by her own parents. The trial took place in Indonesia in April of 2015. Indonesian law would govern the proceedings, and Indonesian penalties would apply. Both Heather and Tommy were charged with premeditated murder. The evidence presented at trial was extensive. Forensic evidence, hotel security footage, text messages, testimony from hotel staff and other witnesses. The defense attempted to argue that this wasn't premeditated, that it was a spontaneous act, that there were mitigating circumstances. But the prosecution systematically dismantled these arguments. The text messages showed planning. Tommy's presence in Bali, staying at a separate hotel, showed coordination. The fact that they had called a taxi and attempted to remove the body showed they understood what they had done and were trying to escape consequences. The Indonesian court found both defendants guilty of premeditated murder. Tommy Schaefer was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Heather Mack, taking into account her age at the time of the crime and her pregnancy, received a sentence of 10 years. By American standards, these sentences might seem light for such a brutal murder, but they reflected Indonesian legal standards and the specific circumstances of the case. Heather gave birth to her daughter, Stella, while incarcerated in Bali. The child was born behind bars and would spend her earliest years in an Indonesian prison. Conditions in the women's prison where Heather served her time were reportedly far different from American prisons. There were reports of relative freedom within the facility. Inmates could socialize, gather together, even have what amounted to parties. Some described it as more of a rehabilitation center than a traditional prison. Heather adapted to this environment. She formed relationships with other inmates. She raised her daughter, as much as was possible in those circumstances. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Sheila's family was grieving and trying to process what had happened. Sheila's sister Debbie spoke to media outlets about the loss. She described Sheila as a woman full of life and love who had never given up on her daughter despite years of difficulties. She talked about how Sheila had always believed Heather could change, could heal from the trauma of losing her father. And she expressed the family's devastation at how Sheila's life had ended. The violence, the betrayal, the way her body had been treated after death. The case received significant media attention, both in Indonesia and internationally. The image of a wealthy American socialite murdered by her own daughter in a luxury resort captured public imagination. News outlets dubbed it the suitcase murder or the Bali suitcase murder. Documentaries were produced. True crime shows covered the case. The story had everything that draws attention: wealth, family dysfunction, violence in an exotic location, a young defendant, a baby born in prison. But for those who actually knew Sheila, the media circus was painful. This wasn't entertainment. This was their sister, their friend, someone they loved, whose life had been stolen by her own child. They wanted justice. They wanted people to remember Sheila as she had been in life, not just as a victim in a sensational crime story. Heather served approximately 7 years of her 10-year sentence in Indonesia. With credit for good behavior and time already served during the trial, she was released in October of 2021. After her release, Heather gave interviews claiming she had changed. She said she wasn't the same person she had been at 18. She talked about how becoming a mother herself had helped her understand her own mother's love. She expressed regret for what had happened. Heather's plan was to return to the United States with her daughter Stella and settle in California. She believed she had served her time and paid her debt to society. She thought the legal consequences were behind her and she could start rebuilding her life. She was wrong. What Heather didn't fully understand was that while she had been tried and convicted in Indonesia, she was still an American citizen, and the United States has jurisdiction over its citizens who commit certain crimes abroad, particularly violent crimes against other American citizens. While Heather was serving her sentence in Bali, federal prosecutors in the United States had been building a case against her. In October of 2021, Heather and Stella boarded a flight from Indonesia to the United States. Heather was smiling in videos taken on the plane. She was holding Stella. She looked happy, optimistic about their future together. The plane landed at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, and that's where Heather's hopes for a fresh start came to an abrupt end. As soon as she stepped off the plane onto American soil, FBI agents were waiting. Heather was immediately arrested. She had been indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of conspiracy to commit murder of a United States national in a foreign country. She was taken into custody. Her daughter, Stella, now 6 years old, was placed with Child Protective Services and eventually with family members in Colorado. Heather was shocked. She told her attorneys she thought she had already been punished for the crime. She had served 7 years in an Indonesian prison. How could the United States charge her again? But her attorneys explained that this wasn't double jeopardy. These were charges under United States federal law, separate from the Indonesian charges. The United States was asserting its right to prosecute its own citizens for serious crimes committed abroad. The federal case moved slowly through the court system. Heather remained in federal custody while awaiting trial. The conditions were drastically different from what she had experienced in Bali. American federal detention facilities are far more restrictive. Smaller cells, less freedom, stricter rules. No socializing with other inmates the way she had been able to in Indonesia. It was a harsh adjustment. Heather's attorneys initially indicated they would fight the charges at trial. They argued that charging Heather again violated principles of double jeopardy. They claimed that she had already been punished, and that further prosecution was unjust. But as time went on and the case progressed, the strength of the evidence became clear. Federal prosecutors had text messages. They had testimony. They had proof of planning and coordination. They had evidence that this was a premeditated murder, motivated by financial gain. In June of 2023, facing the possibility of life in prison if convicted at trial, Heather made a decision. She agreed to plead guilty to the federal charges in exchange for a maximum sentence of 28 years. It was a plea deal, but not one that would see her walk free anytime soon. 28 years, even with credit for time served, meant Heather would spend most of her adult life behind bars. The plea hearing was emotional. Heather appeared in federal court and formally entered her guilty plea. For the first time, she spoke publicly about the crime in an American courtroom. She said she understood now. As a mother herself, the love her mother had for her. She said she wasn't the same person she had been at 18 years old. She apologized to her family members, to her mother's siblings and friends who had filled the courtroom. She said if she could take it all back, she would. Sheila's family members were present for the hearing. For some of them, it was the first time they had heard Heather express what seemed like genuine remorse. Sheila's brother spoke on behalf of the family. He said they were glad Heather had pleaded guilty and accepted responsibility. But no amount of remorse could bring Sheila back. No apology could undo the pain and trauma of how she died. The sentencing hearing took place in January of 2024. Federal guidelines called for a significant sentence given the severity and premeditated nature of the crime. Heather's attorneys argued for leniency, pointing to her age at the time of the crime, her troubled relationship with her mother, and the time she had already served. They painted a picture of a young woman who had been manipulated by an older boyfriend, who had been dealing with unresolved trauma from her father's death, who had made a terrible decision that she now deeply regretted. Prosecutors argued for a sentence at the higher end of the guidelines. They pointed to the brutality of the crime, the fact that the victim was Heather's own mother, someone who had loved her unconditionally despite years of violent behavior, the financial motivation, the attempts to cover up the crime and flee. They argued that Heather needed to be held fully accountable and that a substantial sentence was necessary both as punishment and as a deterrent to others. The judge listened to arguments from both sides. He reviewed the evidence. He considered the victim impact statements from Sheila's family, and ultimately, he sentenced Heather to 26 years in federal prison. This sentence would run consecutively to the time she had already served in Indonesia, though she would receive some credit for the time she'd already spent in federal custody awaiting trial. Effectively, Heather would be in prison until she was in her mid to late 40s. The conditions of federal prison are harsh, particularly compared to what Heather had experienced in Bali. She is confined to a small cell with limited direct sunlight. The rules are strict, and the consequences for violations are severe. There is little freedom of movement, no socializing the way she had been able to in Indonesia. It is, by design, punishment. And Heather will be experiencing that punishment for decades to come. Tommy Schaefer remains incarcerated in Bali, serving his 18-year sentence. With good behavior, he could potentially be released around 2033. However, like Heather, he was also indicted by a federal grand jury in the United States. When he completes his sentence in Indonesia and is deported back to the United States, he will face federal charges here. He will go through his own legal proceedings and likely receive an additional sentence to be served in an American prison. And then there's Stella, the child born into this tragedy. She spent the first 6 years of her life in Indonesia, much of it in or around a prison. When Heather was deported, Stella came with her. After Heather's arrest at O'Hare Airport, Stella was placed with family members. She now lives with one of Heather's cousins in Colorado. Stella lost her grandmother before she was even born. Her father is in prison in Indonesia. Her mother is in federal prison, and will be for decades. She's growing up knowing that her parents killed her grandmother for money. That's a burden no child should have to carry. Those caring for her have tried to provide stability, love, normalcy, But there's no erasing the facts of how she came into this world and what her parents did. Sheila's sister, Debbie, has spoken about how the crime has affected her. She said she can't look at a suitcase the same way anymore. She still travels, but every time she sees luggage, the image is there. What they did to her sister, how they stuffed her body into a case and tried to dispose of her like trash. Debbie said, "The hardest part is thinking about how scared Sheila must have been in those final moments, realizing her own daughter had betrayed her, fighting for her life and losing." This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about family, about love, about how far gone a relationship can become. Sheila loved her daughter unconditionally. She never gave up, even when Heather was violent, even when Heather stole from her, even when police suggested pressing charges. Sheila kept trying, kept hoping, kept believing that love could heal the damage. But Heather had moved beyond healing, whether through her own choices, or through the influence of Tommy, or through unresolved grief over her father's death. She had reached a point where she could participate in the murder of her own mother. For money, for freedom from rules and expectations, for whatever twisted reasons made sense in her 18-year-old mind. This case also shows us the danger of relationships that validate our worst impulses. Heather had been angry at her mother for years, but it was only after meeting Tommy, only after finding someone who reinforced and amplified that anger, that the violence escalated to murder. When two people feed each other's resentment, when they encourage each other's darkest thoughts, when they start seeing eliminating another person as a viable solution to their problems, tragedy follows. The text messages between Heather and Tommy, calling each other Bonnie and Clyde, romanticizing criminality, discussing what they'd do with Sheila's money, these messages show two people spiraling into something terrible together. Neither one of them, alone, might have gone through with it. But together, they convinced each other it was not only possible but justified. And, of course, there's the money. $11 million in assets. $1.5 million in a trust fund. That's the price Sheila's life had in her daughter's eyes. That's what Heather and Tommy thought was worth killing for. It's a reminder that wealth doesn't protect you from violence. In fact, sometimes it motivates it. Sometimes the people closest to you see your assets not as something you've earned, but as something standing between them and the life they think they deserve. What happened in room 202 of the Street Regis Bali Resort took minutes. The attack itself was quick, though Sheila's suffering before death was not. But the consequences of those minutes will last forever. Sheila is gone. Her family will never stop mourning her. Heather will spend the majority of her adult life in prison. Tommy faces the same fate. And Stella, an innocent child, will grow up with this as her origin story. There's no happy ending here. No redemption arc that makes it all okay. Some damage can't be repaired. Some choices can't be undone. Heather can express remorse all she wants. And maybe it's genuine. Maybe she truly does understand now, as a mother, what she destroyed. But understanding doesn't bring Sheila back. It doesn't erase the fear and pain of her final moments. It doesn't heal the trauma her family continues to carry. Sheila Von Wiese-Mack deserved so much better. She deserved to grow old, to travel to all the places she loved, to host more dinners and welcome more friends into her home, to eventually, maybe, see her relationship with her daughter heal. She deserved to meet her granddaughter under circumstances that weren't tragic. She deserved peace after years of struggling with a troubled child. She deserved dignity in death. Instead, she died violently in a foreign country, murdered by her own daughter, her body stuffed into luggage and abandoned. It's a fate no one deserves, least of all a woman who, by all accounts, never stopped loving and fighting for her child. If this case has affected you, I hope you'll take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Untold Cold Case. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case. What do you think drove Heather to participate in her mother's murder? Do you think Tommy manipulated her? Or was she an equal participant? How do you think Stella's life will be affected by her parents' crime? These are difficult questions without easy answers, but I value your perspectives. Thank you for watching this incredibly difficult case with me today. These stories aren't easy to tell, and they're not easy to hear. But they're important. They remind us that darkness can exist anywhere, even in paradise. That danger can come from the people we trust most, and that sometimes, despite our best efforts and deepest love, we can't save people from their own choices. Until next time, stay safe out there. This has been The Untold Cold Case.